I'll create the complete 500-word script about Jean Piaget, focusing on the 4 defense mechanisms that prevent cognitive growth. I'll follow the engaging narrative structure, without subtitles or separations, in a single flowing text block. Have you ever had that uncomfortable feeling that your mind is sabotaging you when you most need to evolve? You know that moment when new information appears right in front of you, something that could completely change your perspective on an important problem. But instead of embracing this discovery, you feel an almost physical internal resistance, as if your brain were literally building walls to prevent that knowledge from entering. You become restless, irritated for no apparent reason, and end up rejecting the idea before even seriously considering it. Perhaps you experienced this at work, when a younger colleague suggested a completely different approach to a project you've been conducting the same way for years, and instead of curiosity, you felt that wave of defensiveness rising through your chest. Or maybe it happened in a relationship when your partner pointed out a behavioral pattern of yours that you had never noticed, and your first reaction was to deny, justify, do anything but look honestly at it. This resistance isn't character weakness or deliberate stubbornness. It's something much deeper and more automatic. It's your cognitive system activating protection mechanisms that were developed to keep your mental structure stable, but that end up becoming the very shackles that prevent your growth. The consequence of this is devastating and silent. You get stuck in outdated thought patterns, repeat the same mistakes year after year, see opportunities for evolution pass before your eyes while your mind actively works to keep you in the cognitive comfort zone. Your relationships stagnate because you can't integrate new perspectives about yourself. Your career stalls because you automatically reject methodologies and concepts that challenge your old mental structures. And the most frustrating part is that you usually don't even realize you're doing this. You genuinely believe you're being rational, that you're protecting your identity, that you're defending important principles, when in fact you're just executing automatic cognitive defense programs that Jean Piaget, one of the greatest scholars of human development, identified with surgical precision throughout decades of meticulous research. Piaget's most disturbing discovery wasn't about how we grow cognitively when things go well. It was about the invisible mechanisms our mind creates specifically to avoid the discomfort of growth, and why these mechanisms are responsible for most people remaining trapped in adolescent mental structures even in adult life. Today I'm going to show you exactly what these 4 defense mechanisms are, that your brain is using right at this moment to keep you limited, how to identify when they're active in your life, and most importantly, the specific process that Piaget documented to deactivate these mental locks and finally allow you to evolve to the more sophisticated and adaptive stages of thought that most people never reach. You'll discover why the feeling of discomfort in the face of a new idea isn't a sign that the idea is wrong, but rather evidence that your cognitive system is trying to keep you in the comfortable prison of obsolete mental schemas. And more importantly, you'll understand what to do specifically when you notice these mechanisms operating, because knowing the problem without having a path of action is just another sophisticated form of remaining paralyzed. In 1923, in the laboratories of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva, Switzerland, Jean Piaget was observing something that would completely change our understanding of how the human mind works. He had before him an 8-year-old girl named Marguerite, and he was conducting an apparently simple experiment. Piaget showed the child 2 identical glasses with the same amount of water. Marguerite confirmed that both had the same amount. Then, right in front of her, Piaget poured the water from one of the glasses into a taller, narrower container. Adult logic says that the amount of water remains the same, only the shape of the container changed. But Marguerite, looking at the taller glass, stated with absolute conviction that now there was more water in that container. Piaget insisted, showed again that nothing was added or removed, but the girl didn't change her mind. What fascinated Piaget wasn't just that the child was wrong, but the emotional intensity with which she defended her mistaken perception. When he tried to demonstrate logically that the amount was the same, Marguerite became visibly uncomfortable, irritated, and began creating elaborate justifications for her belief. She wasn't being stubborn out of whim. Her mental structure at that stage of development simply didn't possess the cognitive schemas necessary to understand the concept of conservation of volume. And here's the crucial part that Piaget realized in that moment. and that would become the foundation of his entire theory about cognitive development. Marguerite's mind wasn't just failing to understand a concept. It was actively resisting information that contradicted her existing mental schemas. It was as if her brain had built a defense system to protect the current cognitive structure, even though that structure was limited and inaccurate. Piaget called this initial phenomenon distorted assimilation, the first of the defense mechanisms that prevent cognitive growth. Distorted assimilation happens when your mind takes new information that contradicts your current mental structures and, instead of revising those structures, it distorts the information so it fits what you already believe. It's like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong place, bending the edges of the piece until it seems to fit, instead of accepting that you need to reorganize the entire puzzle. You don't do this consciously. It's an automatic process that happens in milliseconds before you even realize it. Piaget documented this repeatedly in his research. He presented children with clear evidence that contradicted their beliefs about how the world worked, and they consistently distorted or ignored this evidence to keep their mental structures intact. A child in the pre-operational stage believes that larger objects are always heavier. You show her a large styrofoam ball and a small lead ball. She picks up both, clearly feels that the smaller one is heavier, but still insists that the larger one must be heavier, creating explanations like, "You put something heavy inside the small one or she didn't hold it properly." Her mental structure simply can't accommodate the information that size and weight aren't necessarily correlated. But here's what most people don't realize. This mechanism doesn't disappear when you grow up. It just becomes more sophisticated and invisible. You do exactly the same thing Marguerite did, just with more complex concepts. Think about the last time someone presented a political argument that contradicted your deeply held beliefs. You probably didn't analyze the argument objectively, considering its logic and evidence impartially. Instead, your mind immediately started looking for flaws, reinterpreting the evidence in ways that fit your existing worldview, questioning the credibility of the source, finding any reason to dismiss the information without having to actually process it. That's distorted assimilation in action. Your cognitive structure about politics, built over years and deeply integrated into your identity, acts exactly like Marguerite's structure about volume conservation. It resists revision with the same emotional intensity, the same automatic defensiveness, the same creative justifications. Piaget observed this pattern in adolescents and adults and realized something profound. The mechanism that keeps a 7-year-old from understanding conservation is the exact same mechanism that keeps a 40-year-old from growing beyond their current level of cognitive sophistication. The content changes, the complexity increases, but the underlying defense process remains identical. You're not more evolved than Marguerite when you reflexively reject information that challenges your political beliefs, your relationship patterns, your professional methodologies, or your self-concept. You're operating from the exact same cognitive defense mechanism, just applied to more abstract domains. The second defense mechanism Piaget identified was what he called schema rigidity, and he discovered it through some of his most revealing experiments with children transitioning from concrete to formal operational thinking. In 1936, Piaget was working with a group of 11 and 12-year-olds at his laboratory, presenting them with a classic pendulum problem. He gave them string, weights of different sizes, and asked them to figure out what determines how fast a pendulum swings. The correct answer is the length of the string, not the weight or the force of the push. But what fascinated Piaget wasn't whether they got the right answer. It was how they approached the problem and what happened when their initial hypothesis was proven wrong. He observed a boy named Francois, who became absolutely convinced after his first 2 trials that heavier weights made the pendulum swing faster. When Piaget asked him to test this systematically by changing only one variable at a time, Francois resisted. He had formed a schema, a mental framework about how pendulums work, and now his cognitive system was fighting to maintain that schema, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Francois would conduct experiments but unconsciously change multiple variables at once, making it impossible to draw clear conclusions, because that ambiguity allowed him to maintain his original belief. When Piaget carefully demonstrated that weight made no difference, Francois became agitated and started proposing increasingly complex explanations for why the experiments must be flawed, rather than accepting that his schema was incorrect. This is schema rigidity. Your mind creates organized frameworks for understanding how things work, and then it treats those frameworks as if they were sacred structures that must be defended at all costs. Schema rigidity shows up everywhere in adult life, usually in ways you don't recognize. Think about your approach to productivity and time management. You probably have a schema about how you work best, maybe that you need long, uninterrupted blocks of time, or that you're only creative in the morning, or that you need complete silence to focus. Now think honestly about when you last actually tested those beliefs systematically. Have you ever deliberately tried working in short bursts to see if your belief about needing long blocks is actually true? Or are you protecting that schema because revising it would require restructuring your entire approach to work? Schema rigidity makes you defend your existing frameworks not because they're optimal, but because changing them requires cognitive effort and temporary discomfort that your defense mechanisms want to avoid. Piaget documented this in professional adults repeatedly. A teacher develops a schema about how students learn best, and then spends decades teaching the same way, unconsciously dismissing or reinterpreting evidence that other methods might be more effective. A manager builds a schema about what motivates employees, and then filters all workplace interactions through that schema, never actually testing whether it's accurate for the specific people they're managing right now. The schema becomes a cognitive prison, and schema rigidity is the lock that keeps you inside. The truly insidious part is that schema rigidity doesn't feel like a defense mechanism when it's happening. It feels like wisdom, like experience, like knowing yourself. When someone suggests a different approach and you immediately know it won't work for you, that feeling of certainty isn't coming from genuine self-knowledge. It's coming from your cognitive defense system protecting outdated schemas from the discomfort of revision. Look, I know how frustrating this can feel. You're watching this trying to understand your own mind, maybe recognizing these patterns in yourself, and there's probably a part of you wondering if you're ever going to break free from these invisible barriers. Here's what I want to know. Have you ever had the experience of defending a belief, a habit, or a way of doing something? Not because it was actually working well for you, but just because changing it felt too uncomfortable, too destabilizing, like you'd be admitting you were wrong all along? If that resonates with you, leave a simple comment saying, "I recognize the resistance." Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in this journey of cognitive growth. You have more power to help others see their own patterns than you realize. The third defense mechanism Piaget identified was what he termed developmental fixation, and it's perhaps the most consequential for understanding why so many adults never reach the highest stages of cognitive functioning. In his later work during the 1940s and 50s, Piaget became increasingly interested in why certain individuals progressed smoothly through cognitive stages, while others seemed to get permanently stuck at particular levels. He studied this extensively with adolescents making the transition from concrete operational to formal operational thinking, which is the shift from thinking about actual tangible situations to being able to reason about abstract possibilities and hypothetical scenarios. He observed a 16-year-old named Antoine who could solve concrete logical problems brilliantly, but became completely paralyzed when asked to reason about abstract ethical dilemmas or hypothetical situations. When Piaget asked him to consider what society would be like if certain fundamental assumptions were different, Antoine couldn't engage with the question. He would either say that's not how things are, so there's no point thinking about it, or he would become visibly anxious and change the subject. This wasn't a lack of intelligence. Antoine was quite bright. It was developmental fixation. His cognitive system had become comfortable operating at the concrete operational level, and it was now actively resisting the discomfort and uncertainty that comes with formal operational thinking. The defense mechanism manifests as a refusal to engage with complexity that your current cognitive structures can't handle. Instead of experiencing that discomfort as a signal that growth is possible, your mind interprets it as a danger sign and retreats back to familiar cognitive territory. Developmental fixation is why you see so many adults who are technically competent and knowledgeable, but who can't engage with genuine complexity, ambiguity, or perspectives fundamentally different from their own. They've become fixated at a level of cognitive development that feels safe and manageable, and their defense mechanisms work tirelessly to keep them there. Think about how you respond when you encounter a problem that doesn't have a clear right answer, where you have to hold multiple contradictory perspectives simultaneously and make decisions with incomplete information. Do you lean into that discomfort and use it as an opportunity to develop more sophisticated thinking patterns? Or does your mind start generating reasons why the problem isn't actually that complex? Why it really does have a clear answer if you just apply your existing frameworks? Or why you should avoid that kind of problem altogether? Developmental fixation shows up as a pattern of gravitating toward problems you already know how to solve and avoiding challenges that would require you to develop new cognitive capacities. Piaget noticed this particularly in professional contexts. A highly competent engineer who excels at technical problem-solving might be developmentally fixated at concrete operational thinking, unable to engage with the more abstract strategic and interpersonal dimensions of leadership. And their defense mechanisms will generate elaborate justifications for why those dimensions aren't really important or aren't their responsibility. A therapist might be fixated at a level where they can apply therapeutic techniques competently, but can't engage with the deeper theoretical and philosophical questions about human nature that would develop their practice further, and they'll defend this fixation by claiming to be practical rather than theoretical. The fixation doesn't look like a limitation from the inside. It looks like knowing your strengths, staying in your lane, being realistic about your capabilities. But what it actually is your cognitive defense system convincing you that your current level of development is sufficient, so you don't have to experience the profound discomfort of genuine cognitive growth. The fourth and most sophisticated defense mechanism Piaget identified was what he called equilibration avoidance, and it goes to the heart of how cognitive development actually happens when it happens. Piaget's core theory was that development occurs through a process he called equilibration, where you experience cognitive conflict, a state where your existing mental structures can't adequately explain or handle your experience, and this disequilibrium motivates you to reorganize your cognitive structures to achieve a new, more comprehensive equilibrium. The problem is that disequilibrium feels terrible. It feels like confusion, uncertainty, inadequacy, like the ground is shifting under your feet, and so your mind develops sophisticated mechanisms to avoid ever entering that state in the first place. Equilibration avoidance is the meta-defense mechanism that prevents you from experiencing the cognitive conflict necessary for development. Piaget studied this extensively in his work on how children develop moral reasoning. He would present children with moral dilemmas where their existing rules about right and wrong led to contradictory conclusions. For example, is it worse to accidentally break 15 plates while trying to help, or to deliberately break one plate while stealing cookies? Young children have a simple schema that more damage equals more wrongness, so they'll say breaking 15 plates is worse. But if you press them on the intentionality, they start to feel cognitive conflict. Their schema is being challenged. This is the moment where development could happen, where they could reorganize their understanding of morality to incorporate both consequences and intentions into a more sophisticated framework. But Piaget observed that many children, and later adolescents and adults, would engage equilibration avoidance at this exact moment. They would find ways to dismiss the dilemma, to say both situations were bad in different ways so there's no point comparing them, to get frustrated and disengage, anything to avoid sitting in the discomfort of genuine cognitive conflict long enough for reorganization to occur. Equilibration avoidance is why you can go to therapy for years without changing, read dozens of self-help books without growing, have the same relationship problems repeatedly without learning. The information is there, the insights are available, the cognitive conflict is presented to you, but you engage avoidance before the disequilibrium can do its work. Think about the last time you received feedback that genuinely challenged your self-concept. Maybe someone you respect told you that you come across as arrogant when you think of yourself as confident, or that you're conflict avoidant when you think of yourself as diplomatic, or that you're controlling when you think of yourself as helpful. In that moment, you have a choice. You can sit in the cognitive conflict, allow yourself to hold both your self-concept and this new information simultaneously, Tolerate the confusion and discomfort while your cognitive structures reorganize to create a more nuanced understanding of yourself. Or you can engage equilibration avoidance. You can dismiss the feedback by questioning the other person's motives or judgment. You can explain it away with context the other person didn't understand. You can agree superficially without actually allowing the information to create genuine cognitive conflict. You can distract yourself. You can rationalize. Piaget observed that most people, most of the time, choose avoidance. And each time you do, you reinforce the defense mechanism and make it more automatic. You become increasingly skilled at detecting potential cognitive conflict before it fully forms and neutralizing it preemptively. This is why people can remain essentially unchanged in their core cognitive structures for decades. Not because they're not exposed to new information or challenging experiences, but because they've become masters of equilibration avoidance, expert at managing their cognitive life in ways that never allow genuine disequilibrium to develop. These four mechanisms work together to create what Piaget called cognitive homeostasis, a stable state where your mental structures remain fundamentally unchanged despite ongoing life experience. Distorted assimilation handles incoming information by twisting it to fit existing schemas. Schema rigidity prevents you from revising your frameworks even when distortion becomes obviously untenable. Developmental fixation keeps you operating at a comfortable level of cognitive complexity and generates justifications for not engaging with greater complexity. And equilibration avoidance is the ultimate defense, preventing you from ever experiencing the cognitive conflict that would force structural reorganization. The system is remarkably effective. It's why you can look at yourself at age 45 and realize you're thinking about relationships, work, meaning, and identity in essentially the same ways you did at age 25, despite 20 years of additional experience. Your defense mechanisms have successfully maintained cognitive homeostasis, protecting you from the discomfort of growth while simultaneously imprisoning you in increasingly inadequate structures. But here's what makes Piaget's work so valuable. He didn't just identify these mechanisms. He documented the specific process by which they can be overcome. He showed that cognitive development isn't mysterious or random. It follows predictable patterns, and it can be deliberately cultivated if you understand what you're working against. Piaget's process for overcoming these defense mechanisms starts with what he called reflective abstraction, which is the capacity to step back from your own thinking and examine it as an object. Most people are completely identified with their thoughts. When you think something, you experience it as reality, not as a mental construction that may or may not be accurate. Reflective abstraction is the ability to notice that you're thinking something without being completely absorbed in the content of the thought. Piaget trained children to do this by asking them to explain not just their answer to a problem, but how they arrived at that answer, what assumptions they were making, what alternatives they considered. This is harder than it sounds. When Piaget asked children to explain their reasoning, they would typically just restate their conclusion more emphatically. Training yourself in reflective abstraction means developing the habit of observing your cognitive processes in real time. When you notice yourself reflexively rejecting a new idea, pause and ask, what is the existing schema this information is threatening? When you feel defensive in a conversation, stop and ask, what belief about myself am I protecting right now? When you avoid a complex problem, question, what discomfort would I have to tolerate if I engaged with this fully? This isn't comfortable work. Your defense mechanisms will fight against it because reflective abstraction itself creates a mild state of cognitive conflict. You're introducing distance between yourself and your thoughts, which destabilizes your sense of certainty. But Piaget demonstrated repeatedly that this capacity for reflective abstraction is the prerequisite for all subsequent development. You can't revise cognitive structures you can't see. You can't change patterns you're completely identified with. The first step is always developing enough self-awareness to recognize your defense mechanisms in action. The second phase of Piaget's process involves what he called deliberate disequilibration, which means intentionally seeking out experiences that create cognitive conflict instead of avoiding them. This goes against every instinct your defense mechanisms have cultivated. Piaget observed that children who developed most rapidly were those who actively sought out puzzles, problems, and experiences that challenged their current understanding. They had a kind of cognitive courage, a willingness to tolerate not knowing, that allowed them to enter states of disequilibrium without panic. Adults rarely have this. You've learned through decades of experience that cognitive conflict feels bad, and you've become expert at arranging your life to minimize it. You surround yourself with people who think like you, consume media that confirms your worldview, structure your work to involve problems you already know how to solve, interpret your experiences through comfortable frameworks. Deliberate disequilibration means systematically dismantling these protections. It means actively seeking out perspectives that challenge your beliefs, not to argue with them, but to genuinely understand how someone could think that way. It means taking on projects that require cognitive capacities you haven't developed yet, accepting that you'll be confused and incompetent for a while. It means sitting in conversations where your self-concept is challenged and resisting the urge to defend, explain, or dismiss. Piaget was very clear that this has to be deliberate, because your default state will always be avoidance. Your cognitive defense mechanisms are automatic and powerful. The only way to overcome them is with conscious, sustained effort to put yourself in situations that activate disequilibrium and then stay in those situations instead of retreating. The third phase is what Piaget called accommodation, which is the actual process of reorganizing your cognitive structures to achieve a new equilibrium that can handle the conflicts your old structures couldn't resolve. This is where genuine development happens, but it can't be forced. You can't decide to accommodate and then make it happen through willpower. What you can do is create the conditions where accommodation becomes possible. Piaget identified several key factors. First, you need sufficient cognitive conflict that maintaining your old structures becomes more uncomfortable than revising them. This is why deliberate disequilibration is necessary. If the conflict is mild, your defense mechanisms can handle it through assimilation and rationalization. It needs to be significant enough that those tactics obviously aren't working. Second, you need time and space to sit with the confusion without pressure to resolve it immediately. Accommodation is a reorganization process that happens partly below conscious awareness. If you demand instant clarity, you'll just default back to old structures with minor cosmetic changes. Third, you need exposure to alternative structures that can serve as models for reorganization. This is why learning from people who think at higher levels of complexity than you currently do is so valuable. You can't usually invent entirely new cognitive structures from scratch, but you can recognize and adopt more sophisticated structures when you see them operating in others. Piaget emphasized that accommodation often feels like sudden insight, an aha moment where everything clicks into place. But that moment is actually the culmination of extended disequilibrium and unconscious reorganization. The insight is when your new structure becomes conscious, and you can suddenly see the problem you were struggling with from a completely different perspective that makes it clear and solvable. This is what cognitive growth actually feels like when it happens. Not gradual improvement, but qualitative leaps where you suddenly understand dimensions of reality you literally couldn't perceive before. The final phase in Piaget's developmental process is consolidation, where you stabilize your new cognitive structures through application and practice until they become as automatic and reliable as your old structures were. This is crucial because a newly accommodated structure is initially unstable. When you first develop a more sophisticated way of thinking, you can access it in ideal conditions when you're calm and reflective, but stress or cognitive load will cause you to regress to old patterns. Piaget observed this constantly in his studies. A child who had clearly developed conservation in careful experimental conditions would fail conservation tests when tired or distracted, reverting to earlier thinking patterns. Adults do this constantly. You have a breakthrough in therapy, achieve a new understanding of yourself, but then in the heat of a relationship conflict, you find yourself reacting exactly the same way you always have. The new structure hasn't been consolidated yet. Consolidation requires deliberate practice using your new cognitive structures across diverse contexts until they become your default mode of processing. This means you need to consciously apply your new understanding repeatedly, notice when you're slipping back into old patterns, and redirect yourself to the new structure even when it feels awkward or effortful. Piaget estimated that full consolidation of a major cognitive reorganization takes months to years of consistent practice. This is why sustainable development is slow. You can't rush consolidation. You can only commit to the practice and trust the process. But once a structure is fully consolidated, it becomes effortless. You don't have to think about using it. It's simply how you now perceive and understand that domain of experience. And from that new level, you can see the next layer of complexity that you couldn't access before. The next defense mechanisms protecting the next level of inadequate structures, the next invitation to growth. Looking back at Marguerite and her water conservation problem, what Piaget ultimately understood was that her insistence that the taller glass held more water wasn't a mistake to be corrected. It was a necessary stage in her development, and the resistance she showed to his demonstrations wasn't stubbornness but a healthy protective mechanism, keeping her cognitive system stable while it was still fragile. The problem isn't that you have these defense mechanisms. The problem is staying trapped in them permanently, allowing them to prevent growth that you're now capable of but too protected to attempt. Piaget spent his life documenting that cognitive development continues to be possible throughout life, that there's no biological ceiling where your thinking patterns become fixed. The ceiling is psychological, created by defense mechanisms that were useful at earlier stages, but become limitations if you never learn to recognize and transcend them. Every moment of defensiveness you feel, every reflexive rejection of challenging information, every time you avoid complexity or retreat from confusion, isn't a personal failing. It's your cognitive defense system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question is whether you'll remain a passive subject of these mechanisms, or whether you'll develop the reflective capacity to see them operating, the courage to deliberately seek disequilibrium, the patience to sit in confusion while accommodation happens, and the discipline to consolidate new structures through practice. That choice determines whether you continue growing cognitively throughout your life or whether you peaked at some point in early adulthood and have been defending that level ever since. The invitation Piaget offers isn't to stop having defense mechanisms. That's neither possible nor desirable. The invitation is to develop a different relationship with them, to see them as protective patterns you can work with, rather than immutable facts about who you are. When you catch yourself distorting information to fit your beliefs, you can smile and think, there's distorted assimilation protecting my schemas. When you notice rigidity in your frameworks, you can recognize schema rigidity at work. When you avoid complexity, you can name developmental fixation. When you feel the urge to retreat from cognitive conflict, you can identify equilibration avoidance. And in naming them, in seeing them clearly, you create just enough space between you and the mechanism to choose differently. Not always, not perfectly, but sometimes. And those sometimes, accumulated over years, create a life of genuine cognitive development instead of defensive stagnation. This is what separates people who continue growing throughout their lives from those who calcify early. Not intelligence, not education, not opportunity. The willingness to see your own defense mechanisms and choose growth even when every fiber of your being wants to choose protection. Here's something most people never consider. Right now, in this moment, you're at a choice point. You've just learned about these 4 mechanisms. Your cognitive system knows it's been exposed, and it will do one of 2 things. It will either assimilate this information, distorting it just enough that you can agree intellectually while continuing to operate from the same defended patterns, telling yourself that yes, other people do this, but I'm already quite self-aware. Or it will use this knowledge as an entry point for genuine development, as a moment where the information creates enough cognitive conflict that real reorganization becomes possible. Which path you take isn't about your intentions. It's about whether you're willing to sit with the profound discomfort of recognizing these patterns in yourself. Not as abstract concepts, but as living forces shaping your daily experience. If this video has created any real cognitive conflict for you, if you're feeling that uncomfortable recognition that these mechanisms are operating in your life right now in ways you hadn't seen before, that discomfort is exactly what Piaget identified as the necessary condition for growth. Most people will reflexively try to resolve that discomfort as quickly as possible, to make it go away so they can return to cognitive stability. But what if you stayed with it instead? What if you let the question remain open, let the conflict develop, resisted the urge to defend or explain or dismiss, and trusted that genuine accommodation will happen if you create the space for it? That's the fork in the road. That's the moment where development either happens or doesn't. If you've made it this far, there's a good chance you're someone who genuinely wants to continue growing, who recognizes that the version of yourself you are now isn't the version you're capable of becoming, and who's willing to do the uncomfortable work of cognitive development even when everything in you wants to stay safe. If that describes you, I want to invite you to continue this journey with us. This channel is dedicated to exploring exactly these kinds of deep psychological insights, the mechanisms that shape how you think and perceive and understand yourself and the world, and most importantly, the practical processes for continuing to develop throughout your life. We release new videos every week that go this deep into the work of psychology's most important thinkers, always with the same focus on not just understanding the concepts but learning to apply them to create real transformation. If you're ready to be part of a community that values depth over quick fixes, growth over comfort, and honest self-examination over defensive protection, join us by clicking subscribe. This is just the beginning of understanding how your mind works and what becomes possible when you learn to work with it skillfully. We're going to continue exploring Piaget's developmental stages in detail, looking at exactly what each stage involves and the specific practices for progressing through them. Your next step in this journey is already waiting for you, and I'm excited to take it together.